Welcome to Wiser Dialogue, conversations with women of color about issues, policies, and research that impact our lives. Today, my guests are Joyce Chen, an associate professor of agricultural, environmental, and development economics at The Ohio State University, Melany de la Cruz-Viesca, the assistant director of the Asian American Studies Center at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Estella Lulu Hunt, the CEO of Pivot Partner. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
So this month being Asian Pacific Islander Month, I wanted to have a conversation about Asian women and the ways in which they are excluded from many conversations. And when I mentioned this to someone, they described it as Asian women being erased. And so what I'd like for us to talk about today is one, a little information about what the data looks like for Asians, why it's important to disaggregate the data, and what are some of the implications when we don't disaggregate the data, or the ways that we do disaggregate the data for Asian women. And so Melany, I'd like to start with you.
Well, Rhonda, I definitely hear you on that erasure point because, you know, on the one hand, you know, Asian American, the population size is much smaller than other racial groups. And so when we think about why it's important to disaggregate data, you know, the Census Bureau, it captures or documents about 19 Asian ethnic groups. And so, you know, when you just report out the data by Asians as a whole, you're really missing this nuanced spectrum of you know, differences across Asian ethnic groups. And so a lot of times when you're looking at economic outcomes, what you'll see when you disaggregate the data is that you have like Taiwanese and Asian Indians and Japanese occupying, you know, higher incomes on the spectrum, and where you have lower income Asian ethnic groups such as like Cambodians, Laotians, Vietnamese, and Hmong that really occupy this lower spectrum. So there's this purification that happens with Asian populations. And so when we don't pay attention, when we don't analyze the data and differentiate and disaggregate data, we're really overlooking these ethnic groups. They're not really, a lot of these Asian nonprofits and advocacy organizations not having the data to really serve their communities. And so for advocates and policymakers, really want to make that push why it's important to disaggregate the data.
Okay, thank you, Melany. And I think that segue very nicely, Joyce, into the work that you do around immigration issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, you know, the different historical legacies of how Asian groups came to be in the U.S. It also affects what we observe today in terms of different outcomes for different Asian communities. So starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was actually one of the first pieces of legislation in the U.S. Aimed at immigration policy, and it was the first immigration act that distinguished on the basis of race. So it was a real watershed moment in U.S. policy, but that act prohibited immigration of all Chinese with the exception of a few highly skilled groups, so teachers, merchants, and diplomats, and a few of their family members, and all other groups. This was aimed at keeping out the Chinese laborers who would come here to help build the railroads and during the gold rush. And so that carried over for a long time. You know, even after that act was repealed, which was not until 1943, the Chinese immigration was limited to a quota of 105 individuals every year until 1965. And so that really affects the types of Chinese people that we see in the U.S. compared to other types of Asian communities.
Okay, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because when I would hear people say for the Muslim ban, not my America, I was like, wow, y'all have a short memory, because if you ask Chinese folks who have been here for a minute, they'll be like, this is your America, because we have done this in the past. So Estella, so can you talk to us a little bit about your family's path coming to the U.S. and how it sort of connects to disaggregating groups and being mindful of how folks enter the U.S.?
Sure. So my parents immigrated from the Philippines, and my dad actually was one of the people from the Philippines that were hired on from the Plantation Owners of Sugarcane and Pineapple Plantations in Hawaii. And that group they're called cicadas. And he was one of the laborers that was hired on to work on the plantations. And during that time, he became a naturalized citizen. And that's how my family got to California. I totally agree with disaggregating the data. Truly important to really understand what groups are benefiting from programs and what groups are not, and to identify additional programs to serve that underrepresented population for workforce development, for education. I've seen that there's programs, let's just say from the K through 12, I know you don't like talking about, or K through 12 is not your sweet spot, I will say, that the programs are really for other underrepresented groups, Black and Hispanics, and the Asian API population who are in need of those types of programs aren't necessarily, don't get reached out and are included in those programs.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. I still see, calls for scholarships that say, underrepresented minorities, excluding Asian, sometimes in those exact words, right? Because they just look at the aggregate and not the subgroup.
And I do want to add one more thing as far as the workforce. Let's just say, as an example, for Silicon Valley, Asians are thought to be a large group of the workforce in the tech sector. But this is wiser. This is about women, right? Women and minorities. So to really cut through that data and to say how many Asian Pacific Islander women who are not at the top, but let's just say the Southeast Asian, East Asian groups, where are they? What are they doing? Are they represented? And I will say, I had a conversation with an individual last year from a tech company who helps with outreach for to try and recruit Black and Hispanics, right? Because that's part of one of the diversity inclusion initiatives for companies. And my question to this person was, well, what about Asians and Pacific Islanders? And the response was, they're really not an underrepresented group. And I thought that was very, very interesting. And I understand the answer, but when you cut through the data, that group or the Asian population does not represent, and women, because this is wiser women, there should be initiatives to address that.
Yeah, no, and I think what this conversation really speaks to is how Asians occupy this ambiguous position in terms of race, right? It's like on the one hand, we're the model minority stereotype. I didn't want to have to use it, but like that's the literature, right? But that, we're used as a wedge in affirmative action debates, and when we're really like, what ethnic studies is really about is trying to create these more inclusive conversations and discussions, right? And so, making sure that, communities of color really represent the richness of all these different racial groups, right? And so, so I think we need to start owning our narratives, right? And I think a lot of our ethnic studies scholars are doing that, and Asian American studies scholars and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander scholars, to make sure that, non-Asians are not telling our story and using data in a way that is harmful to our communities.
And I thank you for that, Melany. And Estella's made this point about Wiser's mission, but part of that for me is also making sure that we have narratives that are not deficit-based when we're talking about women, because I think so often the conversations about us are relative to white women, and it is in the ways that we're lacking relative to her, as opposed to just how great we are in our ownness, right? So I want to see us write more of those narratives. Now, having said that, since you opened that door about model minority, let's Do you have any additional thoughts about that?
Because, mostly because of the fact that it's used in a very, divide and conquer strategy, right? And so again, I really think we need to move towards inclusive narratives. And so it's also used by conservative right-wing, politicians most of the times. And so, I think the more that we can start to write about, why we have similar experiences. I mean, no doubt there are differences, but we also have these commonalities across racial groups. I think it makes a stronger case for like why, race is important to understand as part of policymaking, service delivery, and just, I guess, like creating quality life experiences here in the U.S., right? Making sure that no one's left behind.
I think for me, the other thing that's really embedded in the model minority idea is this is being a model sort of in terms of being docile, right? We Asians have this reputation of sort of being quiet, being good workers, right? They're not going to make a fuss. They can sort of be with white people, not be too ethnic, and be really productive at the same time. And so I find that inhibits me a lot, this idea people have that I'm not going to cause trouble, right? Or that Asians are going to be sort of agreeable is really embedded in that model minority idea, right? It's not just a model of achievement, it's a model of behavior that fits in this white norm.
So I want us to talk. We've been talking sort of generic about Asian groups and the model minority, but let's come back and talk about what are some of the ways in which that you see that not disaggregating the data impacts women and not for the best.
Well, I mean, I think it's really difficult, again, to understand what are the needs of Asian American women. I think the data that we do have, it's from like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, shows that, earnings for Asian women compared to men are lagging behind, and I can send you that data. And we also have to think about, when we think about women-owned businesses, and they're mostly like retail, like nail salons, catering or restaurants. And so I think a lot of the SBO data speaks to the fact that, there might be an increase in Asian women-owned businesses, but it's in that sector of, retail industries and not so much in the higher tech, management. I mean, Estella is definitely, changing that narrative, right? But I think for the most part, because a lot of the Asian immigrant women are immigrants still, and they have that language barrier, a lot of times they'll go and start their own businesses, but they're starting businesses that are like increasingly, it's like they have a certain part of the pie. And so there's more competition within that pie when you start to see the number of businesses get owned up, if that makes any sense.
So to try and answer this question, I think that part of what needs to happen, and I think that with where we are today, is to be able to have real good examples and to highlight and to empower the youth, right? To understand that there are people out there, Asian Pacific Islanders, who are doing things, and they're women. They're in the tech space, they're in whatever space, whatever industry, and they're really kicking butt. And to actually raise that awareness with this wiser dialogue, with things that are maybe in film, or that you see on TV or YouTube or whatever media that there is, to highlight women, Asia Pacific Island women, and what they're doing so that they're examples for the youth to say, hey, they're doing it, I can do it. So they have examples of people that look like them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to help break through this model minority, or the thought that maybe Asians or non-Asian or other people that are looking at Asians thinking that they are docile, the women are docile. But it's amazing when the women open their mouth and they're like, wait a minute, you have a voice, right? And I didn't expect to hear that voice.
So I want to piggyback on that. Have any of you seen the documentary about Grace Lee on Netflix? It was just amazing to sort of listen to her. And I think the level of consciousness, because I do think the model minority and so much of the rhetoric that goes on has folks pitted against each other. And at the end of the day, as a woman in America, no matter what your hue, this in general, this just isn't a space for you. So one of the things that I like to do with all of my guests is to ask if there was one myth that you wish people would stop perpetuating, what would that myth be?
So I think part of it, just what I said earlier, is the impression that people may have when they see your face or see you as a person, and they're surprised or their non-expectation that you don't have a voice.
That you don't have a voice?
That you don't, and when you open your mouth, that you do.
Okay.
And they're surprised.
So you're going back to sort of what Joyce said earlier about being docile and submissive. So the myth is that you're docile and submissive, but that's not true.
Right. Docile. Yes. So it's the bias, right, when they first meet you.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think we've been seeing more lately about what people are calling a bamboo ceiling, so similar to the glass ceiling that women face. Is this idea, I think, that perpetuates Asians, being good workers but not good leaders, right? Because they lack that voice and because they lack vision or whatever that elevates you to leadership material, right? Is not something that has been associated with Asians and Asian women in particular. I think really struggle with that moving into those higher ranks. And it's something that we miss again because we don't disaggregate, right? We see sort of on average, Asians are doing okay, well, so enough said, right? Sort of close book, move on.
And I would agree that we just need to stop using this whole blanketed, descriptor of Asians, overall as highly educated, professional and skilled and high income, and so et cetera, and really start to look at things, broken down by ethnic group, and also just to add that this whole idea of Asians as seen as the perpetual foreigner, right? And we're starting to see that play out with U.S. debates with China around the trade talks, and it kind of gives this idea that there could be this repeat of the yellow peril that happened, in the early 1900s. And so I think, just making sure that we really take the time to understand people's position, where they're coming from, their history, their culture, their ethnicity, before we really, just judge a book by its cover, right? Use that old adage. So.
I'd like to thank my guests, Melany Dela Cruz-Viesca, Joyce Chen, and Estella Lulu Keys and Hind. You have been watching Wiser Dialogue, The Missing Viewpoint.